The pearl white Lexus parked across my driveway like she already owned the place. She didn't glance my way. She just stared at the front door, checking her watch, waiting for my husband like a standing appointment. What chilled my blood wasn't the affair itself, but the terrifying clarity that this was a calculated plan. Stepping out of my car, I knew I wouldn't just expose him. I would smash the entire chessboard they had built behind my back. My name is Annabelle Fairfax. I am 41 years old, and my entire professional life is dedicated to finding the buried truth. As a senior contract compliance auditor at the Marston Infrastructure Compliance Bureau, I spend my days dismantling layers of deception. I look at complex construction blueprints, read through hundreds of pages of contractor violations, and spot the tiny, microscopic discrepancies that prove someone is lying. I am paid to see the anomaly. I am paid to notice when the numbers simply do not add up. It was 6:15 in the evening when I turned my sedan onto my street in Alder Ridge. The neighborhood was quiet, bathed in the fading, cold light of dusk. I was exhausted. My eyes burned from 8 straight hours of cross-referencing fraudulent invoices. My shoulders ached under my coat. All I wanted was the familiar, predictable sanctuary of my own house, a hot shower, and a quiet night. But as I pulled toward my property, I saw it immediately, the anomaly. A pearl white Lexus was parked diagonally across my driveway. The engine was running, emitting a smooth, expensive, and arrogant hum that vibrated through the crisp suburban air. The car was not pulled off to the side to allow another vehicle to pass. It was parked dead center, aggressively claiming the space. I put my car in park at the curb, leaving the engine running, and simply stared through the windshield. The woman behind the wheel was a masterclass in careless confidence. Her name was Sloane Mercer, though I would not discover that until later. She wore a tailored cream silk blouse and expensive, oversized sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly styled hair. She was calmly checking her reflection in the rear-view mirror, leisurely adjusting her lipstick. When she finally turned her head and noticed my car idling at the edge of the street, she did not flinch. There was no sudden gasp, no panic, no frantic attempt to hide. She looked at me with the mild, detached annoyance of a woman waiting for a slow valet. Her attitude was a loud, glaring siren in my mind. This was not a panicked first mistake. This was not a careless accident. This was a routine. She sat in my driveway because she felt she had every right to be there. Before I could even open my car door, the heavy oak front door of my house swung open. Caleb Fairfax, my husband, stepped out onto the porch. My breath hitched, not from sudden sorrow, but from profound shock. He was not wearing his usual rumpled office attire. He wore a sharp-as-charcoal gray blazer I had never seen before in our entire marriage, paired with dark, perfectly tailored denim. Even from the curb, I could smell the heavy, unfamiliar wave of a new cologne, rich with cedar and spice. He carried a sleek leather jacket draped carefully over his arm. He looked vibrant, polished, and entirely ready for a private, highly anticipated evening. He turned to lock the door, then spun around and saw my car. He froze on the top step. I watched his face with the clinical precision of an auditor. In my line of work, the initial reaction to being caught tells you absolutely everything you need to know. Caleb did not look terrified. He did not drop his jacket or look at me with pleading, guilty eyes. Instead, his jaw tightened, and a flash of pure, unadulterated annoyance crossed his face. I had not broken his heart. I had broken his schedule. The driver's side door of the Lexus opened smoothly. Sloane stepped out. Her designer heels clicked sharply against the concrete of my driveway. She did not scurry away or try to minimize her presence. She walked right to the edge of the walkway, standing directly between my husband and me. She looked up at Caleb, completely ignoring my existence. "Caleb," Sloane said smoothly, her voice carrying easily in the quiet evening air. "We are running late. The reservation is in 20 minutes. She spoke as if I were a hired gardener, a delivery driver, a minor, irritating obstacle on her path to dinner. I was not the wife. I was a logistical inconvenience. Caleb hurried down the porch steps, physically positioning his body to shield Sloane from my direct view. He looked at me, his face shifting into a mask of patronizing authority. "Annabelle," Caleb said, his voice clipped and tight. "Just go inside the house first. We will talk about this later. Please do not make a scene out here. Just go inside the house first." Those 8 words acted like a chemical catalyst in my brain. For the first few seconds, a heavy, suffocating pain had tried to expand in my chest. I was a betrayed woman looking at the sudden wreckage of my life. But the sheer, staggering audacity of his command, the expectation that I would silently retreat into the shadows of my own home to preserve his dignity, snapped the grief in half. The pain evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a crystalline, freezing clarity. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not drop my work bag or hurl insults across the manicured lawn. I simply reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out my smartphone. I raised the camera. I did not hesitate. Click, the license plate of the pearl-white Lexus. Click, the glowing digital face of my watch, establishing the exact time of the encounter. Click, the defining piece of evidence. Sloane Mercer reaching out, her manicured fingers brushing casually against the sleeve of Caleb's new charcoal blazer right on the concrete walkway we had poured together 10 years ago. Caleb did not pull away. He let her claim him, right there on our front lawn. "Annabelle, what are you doing?" "Stop it," Caleb hissed, genuine anxiety finally cracking his confident facade as the camera flash illuminated the gathering dusk. I did not answer him. I did not lower the phone. I took one deliberate step backward, clearing a wide path to the street, silently offering them an open exit. My absolute icy silence unnerved him far more than a screaming match ever could. He hesitated, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and sudden, creeping fear. Before Sloane elegantly slid back into the driver's seat, Caleb opened the passenger door and got in. The Lexus backed out of my driveway with a soft crunch of tires, shifted gears, and sped off down the street, leaving me entirely alone in the cold air. I stood there for a long moment, letting the heavy silence of the neighborhood rush back in. Then, I turned and walked up my own driveway. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The house was quiet and dark. The thick, unfamiliar scent of his new cologne hung in the foyer like a toxic gas. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl on the console table. As I moved toward the kitchen to turn on the lights, my foot caught on something heavy resting at the bottom of the staircase. I looked down. It was Everly's dark blue canvas duffel, the one she always used for Belmere weekends. A printed luggage tag from the academy was still looped through the handle, and her rehearsal shoes were missing. Caleb had clearly already set her weekend schedule in motion. I stared at the bag, and the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle snapped into place. Everly was supposed to be away that weekend. He had planned it that way. He had built his evening around the certainty that our daughter would not be home. This was not a spontaneous, passionate affair. He had not just cheated on me in a moment of weakness. He had coordinated it. He had deliberately arranged for our teenage daughter to be out of the house so he could play his sick game without interruption. I gripped the handle of my daughter's bag. A cold mechanical energy began to pump relentlessly through my veins. Caleb thought he had just survived an awkward scheduling conflict. He had no idea that he had just handed the entire ledger of his lies to the most ruthless auditor in the city. The investigation had officially begun. The heavy oak door remained firmly shut behind me. I did not run back out to the pavement. I did not frantically dial my husband's number to demand an explanation, nor did I scream into his voicemail. The sudden, chaotic urge to act like a devastated, hysterical spouse simply failed to materialize within my chest. My tears were frozen at the source. Instead, I bypassed the living room entirely, walked upstairs to our master bedroom, and methodically stripped off my professional work clothes. I changed into a pair of faded gray sweatpants and a loose, comfortable cotton shirt. I walked back down the stairs to the kitchen, ground fresh espresso beans, and brewed a dangerously strong, pitch-black pot of coffee. I carried my steaming ceramic mug and my personal laptop to the massive dining table. I pulled out a chair, sat down in the absolute silence of the empty house, cracked my knuckles, and opened a blank, encrypted spreadsheet. I was going to treat my own marriage exactly like a corrupt corporate entity suspected of gross, systemic embezzlement. I began my audit with our primary joint checking account. To an untrained eye, the monthly digital ledger looked entirely mundane. It was a wall of groceries, local utilities, dry cleaning services, and fuel charges. But a seasoned auditor never merely looks at the surface data. We look at the hidden cadence. We search for the negative space where the lies are buried. I downloaded the raw data, filtering the transactions first by retail category and then by the specific day of the week. A distinct, undeniable pattern instantly materialized, glowing harshly against the bright white glare of my screen. Every single Thursday evening for the past 9 months, there was a recurring charge for premium valet parking in the upscale downtown arts district. The fee was always exactly $45. Immediately following the parking charge, there was consistently a tab at a boutique whiskey lounge or an intimate, high-end tapas bar. The amounts were brilliantly calculated to fly under my radar. $68 here, $82 there. He never charged a massive, glaring red flag of a dinner bill. It was a steady, rhythmic bleed of our shared resources. Then, the secondary pattern emerged. Scattered throughout the months were discrete charges at a boutique floral studio. A mysterious payment of $2,400 to a contemporary furniture importer that had certainly never delivered anything to our address. I took a sip of the scalding coffee and dug deeper, shifting my intense focus to our joint savings, specifically the high-yield account heavily earmarked for our eventual ground floor renovation. My eyes narrowed to slits as I tracked the outgoing wire transfers. Caleb ran a boutique design and contracting firm called Fairfax Home Concepts. For the last 3 years, he had complained endlessly at this very dining table about the harsh local market, insisting his business was barely breaking even and practically unprofitable. Yet, there on the glowing screen, I saw the quiet, authorized transfers. $600 moved on the 3rd of the month, $900 transferred on the 17th. $1,500 slipped quietly into his purportedly failing business account just 3 weeks prior. The strategy was chillingly smart. He was not stealing in terrifying, obvious chunks. He was quietly siphoning our life savings. He was creating a steady, highly intelligent financial trail, washing our shared matrimonial assets through his private company. I opened a second secure window on my browser and logged into the secure parent portal for the Belmere Academy for Performing Arts. I pulled up Everly's strict attendance records and the highly specific schedule for her advanced academic residencies. I placed the school calendar side by side with Caleb's banking ledger, adjusting the windows so they perfectly overlapped. The breath physically caught in my throat, forming a hard knot. The alignment was absolutely flawless. Every single time my husband had an unusual spike in dining, premium parking, or mysterious retail expenditures, our teenage daughter was safely tucked away at a mandatory enrichment weekend. He was actively funding his secret, parallel life with our home renovation money, and he was using our child's education schedule as his foolproof, personal alibi. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I was no longer a betrayed wife looking for answers. I was a machine gathering ammunition. I downloaded every single monthly statement for the last 4 years. I took high-resolution digital captures of the correlating dates between the Academy portal and the bank accounts. I plugged a secure, hardware-encrypted external drive into my laptop port and systematically transferred the entire digital dossier. I did not stop at a physical backup. I opened a secure browser network, created a brand new, deeply encrypted email address completely detached from our shared home router or any device Caleb had ever touched, and emailed a compressed file of the evidence to myself. I ensured that even if he destroyed my laptop tomorrow, the ledger of his betrayal would survive intact. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, my coffee was ice cold, but my mind was burning with a terrifying, icy adrenaline. I decided to run one final, comprehensive background check. I logged into my personal credit monitoring service, a tool I used for government clearance. I scrolled past my pristine credit score and clicked directly into the detailed inquiry history. Right there, dated exactly 14 days ago, was a soft credit pull initiated by a major national mortgage lender. It was tied directly to the deed of our property. You do not initiate a soft pull on a fully mortgaged, prime suburban home unless someone is quietly preparing to apply for a massive home equity line of credit, or infinitely worse, laying the covert groundwork for a sudden real estate transaction. This was the moment the ground beneath me completely vanished. He was not just having a sordid affair. He was evaluating the financial equity of the very roof over my head. I picked up my cell phone. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Tessa Rowland, a ruthless, brilliant family attorney I had met at a corporate compliance seminar 6 years ago. Knowing she would be asleep, I dialed her direct office line and waited for the secure voicemail to engage. I did not leave a long, weeping narrative. "Tessa, this is Annabelle Fairfax. I need an emergency appointment first thing Monday morning. I do not need comfort. I need to get ahead of him." I ended the call and set the phone face down on the polished wood. The digital clock on the oven glowed a pale green, reading 2:15 in the morning. I closed my laptop and pushed my heavy chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the tile floor. I stood up and walked slowly to the absolute center of my kitchen. I looked at the custom marble island we had picked out together. I looked at the imported glass backsplash, the heavy stainless steel appliances, and the faded pencil height chart etched into the pantry doorframe, marking my daughter's growth over the last decade. For the very first time in my life, the walls of my own meticulously kept home felt entirely alien and hostile. The warm, ambient light of the pendant lamps felt intensely clinical. I was not standing in a sanctuary of my own making anymore. I was standing in a piece of prime real estate that was actively being appraised by an enemy force. I ran my hand along the cool edge of the counter, feeling an overwhelming, sickening realization wash over my entire body. Someone else had been walking through these rooms while I was at work. Someone else had been mentally taking down my curtains, rearranging my furniture, and measuring my entire life to see exactly how she would fit into the space I was about to be forcefully evicted from. The sun had barely broken over the tree line when I pulled my car onto the highway heading toward the Belmere Academy for Performing Arts. I had not slept a single minute. The digital clock on my dashboard read 7 in the morning. A cold, thick fog clung to the asphalt, mirroring the heavy, calculated silence inside my own head. I did not call ahead to the residential office. I needed to see the unvarnished reality of what my daughter's mandatory academic residency actually looked like. The campus was a sprawling estate of brick buildings and manicured lawns, quiet and still in the early weekend light. I walked straight into the main residential hall and asked the front desk administrator for Everly. The woman behind the desk, a middle-aged dorm supervisor named Mrs. Higgins, looked at me with a profound, thinly veiled surprise. "Mrs. Fairfax," she said, her voice dropping a fraction of a decibel. "We did not expect you today. Your husband messaged the administrative portal on Wednesday, stating the family schedule was simply too constrained to accommodate a pickup this weekend." My posture remained perfectly rigid. I did not betray a single tremor of the emotional earthquake tearing through my chest. "There was a cancellation," I replied smoothly. "I wanted to surprise her, Mrs." Higgins offered a tight, sympathetic smile that sent a spike of pure dread directly into my veins. She pulled up the student registry on her monitor. "Well, I am sure she will be thrilled. She has been so dedicated lately. Staying on campus for 9 out of the last 12 available weekends is quite a commitment for a 16-year-old girl. Although, between you and me, she did ask me a few weeks ago if you knew she was staying behind. She was worried your workload was getting too heavy." 9 out of 12 weekends. The air in the reception area suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Caleb had not just lied to me about her academic requirements. He had lied to the administration, and infinitely worse, he had lied to our child. He had actively used my demanding career as a shield, painting me as an absent, overworked mother who simply could not find the time to bring her own daughter home. He had weaponized my professional dedication to clear his own schedule for his mistress. "I appreciate you looking out for her," I managed to say, my voice sounding like it belonged to a complete stranger. I found Everly sitting alone in the ground floor common room, reading a thick paperback novel by the window. When she looked up and saw me, her expression fractured. For a split second, there was a raw, desperate flash of joy, followed instantly by a heavy, practiced curtain of caution. She stood up quickly, clutching the book to her chest. "Mom," she said, her voice tight and nervous. "What are you doing here? Dad said you had a massive compliance review this weekend and that things were really tense at the house. He said it was better for my future if I stayed focused on the program." I crossed the room and wrapped my arms around her shoulders. She was stiff at first, holding her breath the way a child does when they are anticipating a conflict. I squeezed her tightly, burying my face in her hair. I forced the rising and volcanic anger down into a cold, dark vault in my mind. I could not let her see the monster her father truly was. Not yet. "My review is finished," I told her quietly. "And I wanted to see you. Pack your bags. We are going home." She did not argue. As she gathered her things from her dormitory room, the carefully constructed dam Caleb had built in her mind began to crack. She sat on the edge of her narrow twin bed, zipping up her canvas duffel bag, and refused to meet my eyes. "I do not mind staying, Mom," she said softly, picking at a loose thread on her sweater. "Dad told me you just needed space. He said you were always exhausted after work. That is why he told me not to video call you on Friday nights anymore. He said you were either sleeping or he was caught up in late virtual meetings." I sat down next to her on the mattress, smoothing out the wrinkles in her bedsheet. "Everly, look at me." She slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, carrying a heavy burden of unwarranted guilt that my husband had deliberately placed squarely on her young shoulders. The sheer cruelty of his manipulation took my breath away. He had not only discarded his wife, he had systematically isolated his own flesh and blood to create a pristine, empty stage for his new life. "You are never an inconvenience to me," I said, making sure my tone was absolute, unwavering law. "You are not a burden, and you are not responsible for managing the stress levels of our household. You do not ever have to shrink yourself, hide in a dormitory, or stay quiet to make things easier for the adults in your life." She let out a shaky breath, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. "I just thought it was easier, especially since Dad had his new project consultant coming over so much. I figured he needed the house quiet to work." The room went dead silent. The vault in my mind swung wide open. "A project consultant," I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. "Yeah." Everly nodded, entirely innocent to the explosive charge she had just detonated. "A couple of months ago, when my Friday class got canceled and I came home early, there was a woman in the kitchen looking at the countertops. She had this pearl-white car. Dad said her name was Sloan and that she was a design consultant for his contracting firm. He told me to just stay upstairs so they could finish their layout review. Sloan, in my kitchen? While I was at the Compliance Bureau auditing fraudulent invoices, the woman from the driveway had been standing at my marble island. I said nothing. I just pulled my daughter into another fierce hug, resting my chin on top of her head while I stared blankly at the cinder block wall of her dorm room. The betrayal had mutated into something entirely grotesque. It was a psychological eviction. 45 minutes later, we were in my car, driving down the interstate toward Alder Ridge. I watched the bare winter trees whip past the passenger window. My mind was no longer spinning. It was locking into a deadly focused grid. The affair was nothing but a cheap coat of paint over a massive structural foundation of fraud. The tension in Everly's shoulders had finally melted away, replaced by the comfortable, easy chatter she used to have before the house became a silent battlefield. She was adjusting the radio volume when she casually dropped the final, devastating piece of evidence. "I am glad we are going home," she said, leaning her head against the window. "I was getting worried about having to move anyway." My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned a bruised shade of white. Move? Well, maybe I misunderstood. Everly frowned, looking slightly confused. But a few weeks ago, I overheard Dad talking on his cell phone in the garage. He thought I was asleep. He was talking to that consultant, Sloan. He told her that once the house was listed, things would move much faster. I thought maybe his business was doing bad and we had to sell. Once the house was listed, the highway stretched out before me, a long ribbon of gray concrete blurring at the edges. Caleb and Sloan were not merely having an affair. They were not just waiting for my marriage to decay naturally. They were actively orchestrating a hostile takeover of my primary asset. They had marginalized my child, drained my marital resources, and were now preparing to liquidate my sanctuary from right underneath my feet. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Do not worry about moving, Everly," I said, my voice as cold and hard as a diamond. "We are not going anywhere." Tessa Rowland sat perfectly still behind her massive mahogany desk, her sharp, predatory eyes scanning the printed ledgers and the digital captures I had laid out before her. The early morning light filtered through the heavy blinds of her downtown office, casting long, rigid shadows across the evidence of my ruined marriage. Tessa was a legal surgeon. She did not deal in emotional comfort. She dealt in tactical decapitation. She closed the final folder, folded her hands together, and looked directly at me. "Annabelle," Tessa said, her voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "Listen to me very carefully. You are not going to pack a single bag. You are not going to spend a night at a hotel to clear your head. You will not leave that property for any reason other than your standard work hours or essential errands. If you walk out that door, you hand him the narrative of abandonment. Secondly, do not cut off his phone access. Do not block his number. And absolutely do not throw a screaming fit about fraud tonight. We cannot accuse him of forging documents until we have the entire perimeter secured. We need him to feel comfortable. We need him to get sloppy." I absorbed her instructions like a soldier receiving battle orders. I left her office and drove back to Alder Ridge. The neighborhood was bathed in the quiet, lazy hum of mid-morning suburbia. Before going inside my own house, I walked across the manicured lawn to where Dean Holloway was meticulously pruning his prized rose bushes. Dean was a retired structural engineer who treated our quiet street like his own personal watchtower. Nothing happened within a 2-block radius without Dean categorizing it. "Dean," I said casually, leaning against the low brick retaining wall that separated our properties, "I am doing an audit for my home insurance policy. Have you noticed any unusual service vehicles or traffic around my place during the day while I am at the bureau?" Dean paused, resting his heavy shears against his thigh. He did not miss a single beat. He described a pearl-white luxury sedan. He stated it had been showing up 2 or 3 afternoons a week for the past 5 or 6 months. "The woman driving it," Dean added, his brow furrowing as he recalled the details. "She did not act like a regular guest. She acted like an appraiser. I saw her standing on your back patio taking wide-angle pictures of the yard. Another time, she was measuring the front porch columns. I even saw her cup her hands against the living room window glass to get a clear shot of the interior layout. I figured you two were finally getting ready to list the place." A cold, heavy stone dropped into the pit of my stomach. Sloan had not just been making herself comfortable in my bed. She had been actively staging my home for the market right in front of the neighbors. By Wednesday afternoon, Tessa called me on my secure, unmonitored line. She had called in a major favor from an old contact at the county title office. "Annabelle, the ground is moving faster than we thought," Tessa said, the urgency clear in her crisp articulation. "There is an active application for a massive home equity line of credit attached directly to your property deed. It includes a spousal consent form. It is digitally signed." I opened the encrypted file she forwarded to my secure inbox. I stared at the bright screen, feeling the blood drain completely from my face. There, at the bottom of the financial authorization, was my name. But the sharp loop on the first letter and the slight, lazy slant of the last letter belonged to the signature style I used nearly 7 years ago, back before I modernized my legal stamp for the Compliance Bureau. Caleb had dug through our old tax returns, found a digital copy of my outdated signature, and applied it to a fraudulent loan document. It was a decent forgery, designed specifically to pass a cursory, automated banking check, but it was absolutely not my current, authorized hand. That horrifying discovery pushed me to check the one single place I had foolishly considered sacred and untouched. I logged into the separate brokerage portal that held Everly's educational trust. It was a dedicated college fund we had built dollar by dollar since the week she was born. The dashboard loaded, and the total balance glared back at me. It was drastically, violently wrong. Exactly $18,500 had been withdrawn just 3 weeks prior. I clicked on the transaction history. The electronic transfer note attached to the withdrawal read, "Short-term loan for family business operations." I had to grip the edge of my desk to stop the room from spinning. Caleb was not just stealing my home equity. He was actively stealing our daughter's future to fund his exit strategy and his new life with Sloan. The sheer, breathtaking malice of his actions stripped away the last microscopic shred of grief I held for our marriage. He was no longer my husband. He was a hostile financial threat that needed to be neutralized. I spent Thursday morning at a completely different banking institution across town. I sat with a branch manager and opened a new, secure individual checking account. I immediately filed the paperwork with the government payroll office to route my entire salary away from our joint access. I logged into my employee portal and ruthlessly updated the beneficiaries on my life insurance policy, my retirement portfolio, and my federal stock options. I legally erased Caleb from my financial afterlife in under 45 minutes. When I returned to the house, I walked through the rooms like a forensic investigator. I used a high-definition camera to photograph the antique dining set, the high-end electronics, the valuable artwork we had purchased on trips, and every piece of jewelry in my collection. I logged every single item into a secure spreadsheet with a precise digital timestamp, building an impenetrable wall around my assets. Friday evening, the front door swung open. Caleb walked into the foyer. He did not look like a man whose entire hidden world was standing on a trapdoor. He looked relaxed, confident, and almost smug. He tossed his keys onto the console table and walked into the kitchen, acting as if the catastrophic, life-altering event in the driveway had been nothing more than a minor, embarrassing social friction that we would eventually sweep under the rug like civilized adults. "Annabelle," he said, his voice dripping with a practiced, soothing condescension as he loosened his tie. "We really should sit down and talk about the other night. Things got entirely out of hand." I kept my back to him, methodically washing a single coffee mug in the stainless steel sink. I did not spin around and scream. I did not throw the heavy ceramic mug at his head. I did not demand to know why he forged my name or why he stole our child's tuition money. I simply let my shoulders slump just a fraction of an inch. I played the exact, pathetic role he so desperately expected to see. The deeply hurt, bewildered, and ultimately passive wife who was too afraid of conflict to fight back. I let him believe he was still firmly in control of the narrative, completely unaware that the woman washing dishes in front of him had already loaded the gun that would end his life as he knew it. Caleb leaned his hip against the edge of the kitchen counter, adopting the relaxed, slightly exhausted posture of a man burdened by an unreasonable spouse. He took a slow sip of his sparkling water, letting a heavy sigh fill the silence between us. He was fully prepared to run his favorite defensive play, the one where he painted himself as the long-suffering victim of a neglected marriage. "Annabelle, you are blowing a professional misunderstanding completely out of proportion," Caleb began, his tone dripping with practiced patience. "Sloan is simply a project coordinator. She is helping me secure staging inventory for a difficult client. You completely misread the situation in the driveway. But honestly, I cannot even blame you for jumping to conclusions. You are barely ever present in this marriage anymore." I kept my hands resting flat on the cool marble, my face entirely blank. I let him talk. I wanted to hear exactly how he planned to build his bridge of lies. He took my silence as a signal to push harder, shifting his weight to look more earnest. "We have been drifting apart for years. You have to admit that. You live at the Compliance Bureau. Your entire life is wrapped up in your contracts and your audits. We live in the same house, but we operate like passing roommates. If I have sought out a professional connection that feels supportive, it is only because the environment in this house has become completely sterile. You cannot expect a man to thrive in an emotional vacuum." It was a masterful, sickeningly smooth pivot. He was actively attempting to reframe the narrative, working to make his calculated betrayal sound like the natural, inevitable decay of two people growing apart. He wanted the affair to be a symptom of my failure, not the result of his greed. I picked up the dish towel, dried my hands with slow, deliberate precision, and folded it over the handle of the oven. I turned to face him squarely. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. "Thursday, October 14th, I stated, my voice as hard and flat as a sheet of ice. $45 for premium valet parking in the Arts District, followed by a tab of $82 at the Whiskey Lounge. Thursday, November 2nd, a transfer of $900 from our joint home renovation fund directly into your business account. 9 separate weekends where Everly was explicitly told her mother was too stressed and overworked to bring her home from the academy, effectively isolating our daughter in a dormitory so you could clear this house for your project coordinator." The color drained from Caleb's face in a sudden, violent rush. His confident posture collapsed. The smug, patronizing tilt of his head vanished, replaced by the wide-eyed, frantic look of a man who suddenly realized he had walked onto a battlefield without a weapon. He opened his mouth to speak, but the carefully constructed lies caught in his throat. He realized, in that exact second, that I was not wandering in the dark fog of suspicion. I possessed the map, the compass, and the exact coordinates of his guilt. His survival instinct kicked in immediately. The gaslighting evaporated, instantly replaced by the cold, sterile mechanics of a corporate negotiator trying to mitigate a total loss. "Fine," Caleb said, his voice dropping its warm facade, turning clipped and defensive. "If you have already made up your mind to tear this family apart over an aggressive misunderstanding, then let us at least handle this like civilized adults. We do not need to drag this through the mud. We can list this house quietly. We split the equity right down the middle, 50-50. We organize a standard, amicable co-parenting arrangement for Everly. We can separate our assets smoothly without making a massive public scene." He was offering a surrender that was actually a trap. He wanted an informal agreement, a quick handshake to lock me into a passive exit before I uncovered the rest of the rot. "I am not interested in your verbal proposals," I replied, staring directly into his panicked eyes. "I will not discuss the sale of this property, nor will I negotiate the division of any marital assets with you standing in my kitchen. If you have a formal proposal, you will submit it in writing to my legal counsel, Tessa Rowland. From this precise second forward, I do not believe a single word that comes out of your mouth. I only believe paper." I turned my back on him and walked out of the room, leaving him standing in the absolute wreckage of his strategy. Later that night, the house was dark and suffocatingly quiet. I lay awake in the guest bedroom, staring at the shadows moving across the ceiling. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard the faint, muffled sound of the side door opening. I slipped out of bed, moving silently down the carpeted hallway until I reached the door leading to the attached garage. I pressed my ear against the cold wood. "She knows about the dates," Caleb was whispering frantically into his cell phone. His voice echoed slightly against the concrete walls of the garage. "She pulled the transaction history. No, she is not screaming. It is worse. She hired Roland, yes, the corporate shark." A heavy pause followed as he listened to the woman on the other end of the line. Then, he let out a harsh, arrogant breath. "Do not panic. I know how she operates. She hates instability. Once I freeze the joint liquid cash and the financial pressure actually hits her, she will cave. She will sign whatever we put in front of her just to make the conflict stop." I stepped back from the door, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. He still thought I was the old Annabelle. He still believed he held the leverage. He thought financial pressure would break me. Completely unaware that I had already redirected my income and walled off my independent assets, I returned to the guest room, opened my laptop, and decided to follow the paper trail he had just confirmed was his primary weapon. I logged into the State Business Registry database and paid the nominal fee to pull the most recent filing amendments for his company, Fairfax Home Concepts. The document loaded on my screen, and the truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. Exactly 30 days ago, Caleb had filed a formal amendment to the operating agreement of his limited liability company. He had officially added Sloan Mercer to the corporate structure. Her designated title was listed as Creative Consultant. It was a brilliantly vague, utterly meaningless designation designed for one specific purpose: to completely legitimize the flow of our marital money into her pockets. She was not just a mistress, she was a legally protected business expense. But the corporate registry was not the final layer of the nightmare. I opened a separate search window and began scouring the private, broker-only real estate networks using a backdoor access portal I occasionally utilized for municipal compliance checks. I searched our exact property address. It took me 20 minutes to find it, hidden in a secure, off-market portfolio. It was a glossy, fully prepared digital listing brochure for my own home. There were high-resolution photographs of the exterior, the manicured lawn, and the living room, exactly as the neighbor had described, but it was the legal phrasing in the agent notes that made my blood run entirely cold. The listing positioned Caleb Fairfax as the sole primary contact and the explicit decision-maker for the property. My name was noticeably absent from the property description, the seller profile, and the contact sheet. I sat back in the chair, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off my face in the dark room, the pieces locked together, forming a picture far more devastating than a simple betrayal of vows. The affair was nothing but a biological distraction. The true violence was administrative. They had manipulated my daughter out of the house. They had drained the equity in the college funds. And now, they had drafted a legal reality where I simply did not exist. Caleb did not just want to leave me. He and Sloan intended to completely erase me from the very foundation I had spent a decade building, turning me into a ghost inside my own walls before finally throwing me out onto the street. I needed Caleb to feel entirely secure. A cornered man is unpredictable, but an arrogant man is exceptionally careless. The morning after our tense confrontation in the kitchen, I woke up early, brewed the coffee, and poured him a cup just as he walked downstairs. I stood by the island, letting my shoulders droop, manufacturing a look of profound, exhausting defeat. I looked at the floor, refusing to meet his eyes, playing the part of a woman whose spirit had finally been broken by the sheer weight of the conflict. "Caleb," I said quietly, keeping my voice soft and hesitant. "I am just so tired of fighting. I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe we can revisit your idea about the property. After the holidays, maybe we can look into listing the house and figuring out a quiet way to split things up. I just want this awful tension to be over." The relief that washed over his face was instantaneous, total, and utterly sickening to witness. The rigid, defensive posture he had carried into the room melted away. He actually exhaled a long breath, walked over, and patted my hand with a patronizing, gentle condescension. He truly believed he had won. He thought the financial pressure he assumed I was feeling, combined with my demanding career, had finally cracked my resolve. By simply pretending to surrender my territory, I gladly handed him the shovel he would use to dig his own grave. His newly restored confidence bred an astonishing, almost comical level of sloppiness. With the perceived threat of my resistance completely neutralized, he stopped guarding his digital footprint. He no longer treated his devices like secure vaults. The fatal flaw in his perfect crime was the old, battered family tablet we kept on the side table in the den. It was a device mostly used for streaming the news or looking up recipes, but it was still automatically synced to his primary cloud storage account from years ago. Late Tuesday night, while he slept deeply down the hall, I picked up the tablet. The screen illuminated the dark room, displaying a real-time, unfiltered treasure trove of his arrogance. I bypassed the standard applications and opened a newly created, synchronized folder of shared notes, voice recordings, and highly detailed photographs of our home's interior. The data served as a meticulous blueprint for a hostile takeover. I opened a direct message thread between my husband and his creative consultant. They were casually, brutally debating the logistics of erasing my existence from the property entirely. "We need to clear out Annabelle's office by the end of the month," Sloan wrote in a text message dated exactly 14 days prior. "We can paint it a neutral beige. It needs to look like a versatile guest room, not a heavy shrine to corporate compliance. We can easily schedule the private buyer showings on the second and fourth weekends of the month to avoid any overlap." I stared at the glowing screen, feeling the blood turn to absolute ice in my veins. The second and fourth weekends of the month were the exact, non-negotiable dates Everly was scheduled for her mandatory academic residencies at the academy. My husband was using his daughter's school schedule as a real estate strategy. Then, I scrolled down to the very next message. It was a text from Sloan that hit me harder than a physical strike to the chest. "The house will photograph so much better when the kid is not hanging around on the weekends to mess up the staging," she wrote. "We need the space looking completely pristine." It was a level of cold-blooded, calculating cruelty I had never imagined possible. This revelation transformed the entire landscape of his betrayal. They were not merely taking advantage of my teenage daughter's absence to carry on a sordid romance. They were actively, deliberately maintaining her isolation. They were treating my child like an unsightly piece of living room clutter that needed to be swept out of the frame so they could construct their perfect, highly profitable exit strategy. The affair was completely irrelevant now. It was nothing but a cheap coat of paint masking a massive structural foundation of fraud. This was a methodical plan to sanitize my home of my family's existence. The next afternoon, Tessa Rowland called my secure line with the definitive legal ammunition we had been waiting for. "Annabelle, we have the lock," Tessa said, her voice a sharp, surgical instrument. "I just received the certified copies from the county title office and the underwriting bank. We have absolute proof. The digital signature on the home equity line application is a direct, unauthorized copy of an electronic tax document you signed exactly 6 years ago. It is a fabricated stamp. He used a copied signature to support a fraudulent loan application against your property." Equipped with that knowledge, I dove back into our digital archives. I bypassed his current accounts and accessed an old, largely abandoned family email address Caleb and I used to use for shared household utility bills. He had recently resurrected it, assuming I had long forgotten the password. I found a string of sent emails dating back over 7 months. Long before he ever claimed our marriage was failing. Long before any fabricated discussion of an amicable separation or drifting apart. Caleb was actively soliciting professional quotes to dismantle my life. I sat at my desk, reading the undeniable timeline of his treachery. He had emailed 3 different local contractors requesting estimates for interior painting, specifically asking for neutral, buyer-friendly tones. He had contacted a luxury furniture staging company. He had even engaged a boutique, high-end listing agency for a private market consultation, using our exact address. The timeline was irrefutable. Every single action was deeply premeditated. The standard, emotional advice for a betrayed spouse would be to immediately confront the cheating husband, to throw the forged bank documents in his face, scream until my lungs burned, and demand he pack his bags and leave the premises that very night. But Tessa and I were playing a much longer, far more lethal game. If I blew the whistle right then, Caleb could call his lawyers and claim panic, financial pressure, or a temporary lapse in judgment. He could try to weave a sympathetic narrative of a desperate man making a singular, terrible mistake under the immense stress of a dying marriage. I could not allow him that grace. I needed his actions to form an unbreakable, undeniable chain of malicious intent. So, I chose absolute silence. I let the fraudulent machinery he built continue to operate right in front of my eyes. I watched him smile at me over the breakfast table, knowing with total certainty he had forged my name on a loan document the day before. I listened to him complain bitterly about his failing contracting business, knowing full well he was funneling our joint savings directly to his mistress. Instead of striking, I let the behavior drag on day after day, week after week. I meticulously documented every single lie, every single financial transaction, and every single covert arrangement. The narrative of the heartbroken, weeping wife mourning a lost romance was completely dead and buried beneath a mountain of evidence. I no longer cared if Caleb Fairfax was in love with Sloane Mercer. I no longer cared about his emotional deficits, his perceived unhappiness, or his midlife crises. I only cared about proving, beyond a shadow of a legal doubt, that the man sleeping in the room next to mine had spent the better part of a year secretly conspiring to steal the entire foundation of my life. I was no longer a wife. I was the architect of his total ruin. I pulled Everly out of the academy the very next morning and transferred her temporarily to the local arts magnet high school just 4 miles down the road. The shift in her entire physical and emotional presence was immediate and profound. Within 14 days, the heavy, dark circles under her eyes vanished. She began sleeping completely through the night instead of pacing her room. The overly cautious, hyper-vigilant silence she had adopted at the dormitory melted away, replaced by the loud, vibrant chatter of a 16-year-old girl who finally felt safe in her own space. Watching her sit at the kitchen island, laughing as she painted her nails, fueled a fierce, protective fire in my blood. Her recovery clarified the battlefield perfectly. I saw with absolute, blinding certainty who had kept the heartbeat of this family alive, and who had deliberately, methodically let it rot from the inside out to serve his own greed. Meanwhile, the financial tripwire Tessa and I had quietly installed began to strangle Caleb's hidden world. By freezing the joint accounts and locking down my salary, the capital required to finalize his fraudulent home equity loan evaporated. The sudden lack of fluid cash caused an immediate violent disruption in his relationship with his creative consultant. Sloane Mercer did not deal in struggles or setbacks. She dealt in smooth, profitable transitions. Her attitude toward my husband turned remarkably cold the moment his purchasing power stalled. Through the quiet, highly efficient gossip network of Alder Ridge, I learned exactly how transactional their romance truly was. Dean Holloway mentioned casually over the fence that the pearl-white car had stopped coming around during the weekday afternoons. A few days later, a colleague whose sister worked at a premier commercial brokerage downtown confirmed the rest. Sloane was aggressively courting a massive, out-of-state commercial developer. She was actively pivoting to a much larger target. Her plan to secure a luxury condominium using our stolen marital funds had fallen through, proving definitively that Caleb was never a grand, sweeping love affair. He was merely a temporary, convenient rung on her ladder, and now that his wallet was frozen, he was losing his grip. Caleb felt the sudden, terrifying drop in temperature. Though he still had no idea I was the one controlling the thermostat, his behavior became wildly erratic. His carefully constructed mask of a reasonable, deeply unsatisfied husband began to slip, revealing the desperate manipulator underneath. One evening, he walked into the den holding a dusty silver-framed photograph from our honeymoon in coastal Italy. He sat heavily on the sofa, his voice thick with a manufactured, theatrical sorrow, begging me to remember the good years we had built. He tried to cast his betrayal as a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by intense loneliness. When I simply continued typing on my laptop, refusing to give him a single ounce of emotional currency, his sorrow instantly warped into pure malice. "You are going to lose everything if you fight me on this," Caleb hissed, his face twisting into an ugly, unfamiliar sneer. "Do you think a family court judge is going to hand primary custody of a teenager to a frigid, obsessed corporate auditor who practically sleeps at the Compliance Bureau? You are never here. I am the one who manages this household. I will paint you as an absentee mother so fast your head will spin. You will be lucky to get weekend visitation." He truly believed his own fabricated narrative. He vastly underestimated the meticulous, obsessive nature of a woman who audits for a living. I did not raise my voice to argue with him. I simply waited for him to leave the house. Then I opened a new secure digital directory. Over the next 48 hours, I compiled a crushing, insurmountable mountain of evidence. I downloaded 7 solid years of pediatric dental records, signed permission slips, and detailed email chains with homeroom teachers. I gathered emergency contact logs, volunteer sign-up sheets, and thousands of credit card receipts for ballet shoes, private tutor sessions, and late-night pharmacy runs for fever medication. I built an impenetrable fortress of documentation, proving exactly who carried the massive, invisible mental and physical load of raising our child. I was the foundation. He was just a guest. Tessa did not hesitate to drop the hammer. The following Tuesday morning, she formally filed an aggressive emergency motion for temporary exclusive use and occupancy of our marital residence. Attached to that motion was an ironclad, legally binding demand for the immediate, full restitution of the $18,500 he had illegally drained from Everly's educational trust fund. The legal paperwork was served directly to his failing business office. The preliminary settlement conference took place in a sterile, brightly lit room at the county courthouse. Caleb wore a conservative navy suit, projecting the calculated aura of a deeply wounded but entirely reasonable patriarch. For 45 minutes, he spun a masterful, heartbreaking tale to the court-appointed mediator. He spoke softly of his struggling contracting business, the crushing weight of household debt, and his desperate, misguided attempt to quietly restructure our finances to save the family from ruin. He expertly minimized the presence of Sloane, brushing her off as a minor professional indiscretion magnified by my intense jealousy. He sounded incredibly convincing. The mediator nodded sympathetically, clearly buying into the narrative of the tragic, overwhelmed provider. Then, Tessa leaned back in her leather chair and simply handed me the floor. I did not speak of infidelity. I did not shed a single tear or complain about a broken heart. I slid a thick, perfectly bound folder across the polished mahogany table. I opened it to the first tab and presented the official, stamped weekend attendance logs from the Belmere Academy. My husband is not a desperate provider attempting to stabilize his family, I told the mediator, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. He is a predator who used my career as a shield to isolate his own child. These logs confirmed that on 9 separate occasions over the last 3 months, he fraudulently used my name and my work schedule as a cover story to intentionally trap our teenage daughter in a school dormitory. He did this specifically to use our primary residence as an empty staging ground for a real estate venture with his mistress. The color completely drained from Caleb's face in a sudden, violent rush. The mediator's sympathetic expression vanished instantly, replaced by a hard, calculating stare as she reviewed the irrefutable dates and times. The carefully constructed illusion of the struggling father shattered into a million pieces right there on the conference table. For the very first time since I found him standing on the driveway, my husband walked out of a room looking entirely unmoored. His shoulders were slumped, and the arrogant certainty had been completely wiped from his eyes. He realized he was standing on the edge of a massive, devastating cliff. Yet, as I watched him furiously text someone while pacing the courthouse lobby, I knew he was still desperately clinging to a pathetic delusion. He still firmly believed the woman with the pearl-white car would swoop in and stand by his side when the final battle began. The following days were a descent into the absolute darkest corners of Fairfax Home Concepts and its supposedly failing financial ledgers. I bypassed the standard profit and loss statements and started pulling the raw, unedited vendor invoices. That was where the real story lived, breathing beneath the numbers. Row after row of massive expenditures were buried under the intentionally vague category of staging inventory. But when I cross-referenced the vendor names with the actual delivery addresses, his carefully constructed facade crumbled to dust. He was not buying staging furniture for clients. He had authorized a security deposit for a high-end, climate-controlled storage facility on the east side of the city. More damningly, he had signed a 12-month residential lease for a luxury apartment in North Ellery. North Ellery was a trendy, affluent neighborhood located nearly 20 miles away from our quiet suburban street, I had never once heard him mention a contracting project in that zip code. The storage unit records showed it was packed with brand new, premium leather sectionals, imported dining chairs, and a custom California king mattress, all purchased with our marital funds. The next evening, while I was preparing dinner, Everly stood by the kitchen sink, quietly washing vegetables. She looked over at my open laptop on the island, her eyes catching the bold heading of the North Ellery address on the digital lease agreement. She hesitated, biting her lower lip, clearly torn between loyalty to her father and the heavy truth sitting in the room. "Mom," she started, her voice dropping to a nervous whisper. "Is Dad still working on that sample unit?" I froze, the chef knife hovering an inch over the cutting board. I asked her exactly what she meant, keeping my tone perfectly even so I would not frighten her into silence. She looked down at the floor, suddenly ashamed. "A few months ago, he took me to a building in North Ellery," she confessed softly. "He said it was a test project for his company, a sample unit to show high-end clients how good his designs were. He made me promise not to tell you because he wanted to surprise you when the business finally took off and made a lot of money." The sickness in my stomach instantly twisted into pure, unadulterated rage. He had the audacity to introduce our teenage daughter to the woman he was secretly seeing. He had actively made her a silent, unwitting accomplice in his own infidelity, feeding her a fairy tale about a business surprise while he used her college funds to buy the bed he intended to share with another woman. I immediately forwarded the lease agreement, the storage facility receipts, and a transcribed summary of Everly's statement directly to Tessa. The legal picture was now utterly flawless. Caleb had not just engaged in an emotional or physical affair. He had systematically cannibalized our marriage, siphoned our joint life savings, and looted his own child's education trust to fully furnish and secure a private, luxury sanctuary for his new life. He was feeding his future with Sloan using the absolute lifeblood of our past. The retaliation from the judicial system was swift and absolute. Within 48 hours, the county judge granted our emergency ex parte motions. The court issued a crushing freezing injunction. Caleb was legally barred from listing our primary residence on any market. He was strictly prohibited from opening any new lines of credit tied to our marital assets. And a hard, impenetrable lock was placed on what remained of Everly's tuition accounts. His financial guillotine, the precise weapon he intended to drop on my neck to force a quick settlement, had been permanently jammed. Cornered animals are notoriously vicious, and Caleb was no exception. Stripped entirely of his leverage and his secret funding, he fired back through his own legal counsel. He submitted a massive, verbose counter-declaration to the court. Reading his sworn affidavit was like reading a poorly written psychological fiction novel. He painted an elaborate, tragic portrait of himself as a suffocated, desperate man. He described me as a tyrannical, controlling auditor who ran our household with the cold, emotionless efficiency of a corporate boardroom. He claimed my intense obsession with my career had created a toxic, suffocating environment, practically forcing him to seek peace, warmth, and financial independence elsewhere. It was a beautifully articulated narrative, designed to pull on the heartstrings of a judge, but it was completely devoid of any actual, verifiable facts. It was a story built entirely without a spine. I did not engage in a public shouting match. I did not post vague, angry statements on social media or call his extended family to defend my honor. I treated his absurd counterclaim as nothing more than a new set of data points to systematically destroy. I sat at my dining room table, night after night, building an airtight, chronological timeline. I stacked the fraudulent bank applications against the North Ellery lease agreements. I matched his fabricated business expenses against the exact dates he stranded Everly at the academy. I organized witness subpoenas, banking statements, and my own sworn declarations. My legal binder was clean, cold, and entirely devoid of emotional loopholes. I was preparing for a slaughter. It was late Thursday night, pushing past 11 o'clock. The neighborhood was dead silent, locked in the grip of a cold, moonless dark. I was standing by the kitchen window, pouring the last of my herbal tea, when the bright motion sensor lights on the garage suddenly clicked on. flooding the driveway with harsh white light. I looked through the glass. The pearl-white Lexus was parked exactly where it had been on that first, life-altering evening. It sat right in the middle of the concrete, but this time, the engine was cut. The driver's side door opened, and Sloane Mercer stepped out into the freezing night air. She was completely alone. She did not march up the walkway with the arrogant, untouchable stride of a woman claiming her territory. She walked hesitantly, her shoulders hunched against the cold, clutching a thick manila envelope tightly to her chest. She looked over her shoulder toward the street, looking genuinely terrified. I unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch, letting the heavy wooden door click shut behind me. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at me. The pristine, confident facade was entirely gone. "I am not here to fight you, Annabelle," Sloane said, her voice shaking slightly, entirely stripped of its former polished superiority. She was not here to gloat about winning my husband. She was here on a desperate rescue mission to save herself from the impending legal blast radius. "Caleb lied to me too," she continued, taking a step closer, holding out the heavy envelope like a white flag of surrender. "He told me the divorce was already finalized months ago. He told me the house was legally his to sell. He dragged my name onto his corporate documents without ever telling me you were going to audit the firm. I cannot be dragged into a mortgage fraud investigation tied to this property. I have a career. I have a broker's license." She took a deep, ragged breath, her eyes wide with genuine panic. "I have everything in here. Every single text message. The audio files he sent me bragging about clearing you and your daughter out of the house. The draft emails where he planned to forge your signature on the equity line. I have the entire blueprint. And I will give every single piece of it to you right now, if you just promise not to drag me into the subpoenas tied to the property and the loan records." I took the heavy manila envelope from Sloane's trembling hands. The night air was freezing, biting through the thin fabric of my sweater, but the cold radiating from the package she offered felt infinitely worse. Sloane stood on my concrete walkway, her breath pluming in the dark, actively stripping away the very last remnants of the illusion my husband had built. "He never promised me a ring," Sloane confessed, her voice thin, hollow, and entirely devoid of the arrogant superiority she had displayed months ago. "He never promised me a wedding or a beautiful blended family. He promised me the exclusive broker listing on this property. He promised me a flat 6% commission on $1 million sale, plus a substantial cut of the equity he was pulling out through the fraudulent loan. It was a business transaction. Annabelle, I played the part of the devoted girlfriend because it secured the listing and the commission. I did not offer her absolution. I did not thank her. I simply took the envelope, turned my back on her, and walked inside, locking the heavy deadbolt behind me. I carried the package to the dining room table, turned on the harsh overhead chandelier, and poured out the contents. It was a staggering mountain of data. There were hundreds of printed screenshots, pages of drafted emails, and a small, sleek silver flash drive. I picked up the first stack of printed text messages. The timestamp printed at the top of the page corresponded exactly to the late afternoon of the day I first found them in my driveway. I read the exchange, and the floor seemed to vanish beneath my feet. "Park right in the middle of the concrete." Caleb had written, "Keep the car running. When she pulls up, do not move. Make sure she sees you touch my arm." "Are you sure?" Sloane had replied. "What if she causes a scene right there in the driveway?" "She will not," Caleb answered. "She avoids public conflict at all costs, but it will humiliate her enough to break her. If I can get her so angry that she packs a bag and leaves the house for just 48 hours, I win. My lawyer said if she walks out in a blind rage, I can control the entire narrative. I can tell the courts she abandoned the family first. It practically hands me the property by default." My lungs stopped working. The breath was completely punched out of my chest. The driveway incident had not been a careless mistake. It had not been a moment of arrogant sloppiness. It was a highly calculated, meticulously directed psychological ambush. He had intentionally orchestrated my public humiliation, hoping my devastation would cause me to act irrationally. He wanted me to run away in tears so he could legally lock the doors behind me and claim I was an unfit, unstable mother who walked out on her child. My hands shook as I plugged the silver flash drive into the side of my laptop. I opened the audio folder and clicked on a voice memo dated exactly 3 weeks prior. Caleb's voice filled the quiet, empty kitchen. He sounded incredibly relaxed, the distinct clinking of ice in a glass echoing in the background as he left a message for his mistress. I got the school portal updated. His recorded voice drifted through the room, dripping with an unbearable, casual cruelty. Everly is completely locked in for the next 3 weeks. I told the residential administration her mother is having a severe mental breakdown from work stress, and the house is a toxic environment. They bought it completely. It guarantees us clean weekends. No kid hanging around to mess up the staging inventory. No sudden interruptions. The house is a perfect blank canvas until the listing goes live. Clean weekends. He had referred to the deliberate, forced isolation of his own 16-year-old daughter as a clean weekend. The pain that hit me then was entirely physical. It was a suffocating, blinding agony that dropped me to my knees right there on the hardwood floor. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, gasping for air in the silent house. But the pain did not break my mind. It did not send me into a spiral of helpless confusion. Instead, it burned away every single lingering doubt, every trace of mercy, and every memory of the man I thought I had married. The intense agony acted like a powerful forge, hammering my thoughts into a straight, perfectly aligned row. I was no longer dealing with a cheating spouse. I was dealing with a monster who viewed his family as disposable pawns on a real estate board. By 8 o'clock the next morning, I was sitting in Tessa Rowland's office. I slid the entire envelope and the flash drive across her polished desk. Tessa did not offer useless sympathy. She functioned with the lethal efficiency of a military strategist. Within 3 hours, her legal team had transcribed the audio, verified the digital timestamps on the text messages, and bound every single piece of Sloane's betrayal into a massive, unassailable sworn affidavit. She secured the chain of custody and held the evidence back for the exact moment Caleb felt safest. The final mediation session was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday morning at the Marston County Administrative Building. Caleb arrived exactly 15 minutes early. I watched him walk into the large wood-paneled conference room from the hallway. He looked like a man who had already cashed the winning lottery ticket. He wore a crisp, tailored charcoal suit, his posture radiating an almost unbearable level of smug self-assurance. He smiled warmly at the mediator, leaning back in his leather chair, entirely relaxed. He genuinely believed he was walking into a room to face a highly emotional woman who was too exhausted, too cornered, and too afraid of public exposure to push any further. I walked in wearing a sharp black suit and carrying a single leather binder. I sat down across from him, placed my hands flat on the table, and said almost nothing. No agreement was reached that morning. Caleb left the building convinced he still had the upper hand. He believed I was stalling. He believed I would eventually fold. 2 weeks later, the heavy oak doors of the Marston County courtroom sealed shut behind us, locking out the noise of the hallway. The air inside the chamber was dense, formal, and smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. Caleb took the witness stand first. He wore his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, adjusting his tie with hands that only slightly trembled. His posture radiated the practiced, exhausted sorrow of a man who was simply trying to do his best under impossible circumstances. He repeated the exact same fictional narrative he had been rehearsing for months. He spoke softly, his voice echoing in the quiet room, talking about a marriage that had organically crumbled under the crushing weight of emotional distance and professional obsession. He looked the judge directly in the eye and swore under oath that he was only trying to quietly stabilize our joint finances to provide a civilized, amicable exit for everyone involved. It was a masterful, heartbreaking performance. Tessa Rowland did not object. She did not interrupt his poetic soliloquy with emotional outbursts or angry accusations. When it was her turn to cross-examine and present our case, She approached the center of the room with the cold, mechanical precision of a ticking clock. She did not argue about broken hearts, neglected vows, or midlife crises. She argued using a sequential, chronological timeline of sheer malice. She started with the high-resolution photograph of the driveway, establishing the exact date, the precise time, and the deliberate physical contact. Then, she immediately submitted the certified weekend attendance logs from the Belmere Academy, overlaying them flawlessly with the days Caleb had cleared our house for his secret meetings. She presented the bank statements showing the exact, unauthorized withdrawal of $18,500 from our daughter's college fund. She entered the forged home equity line of credit application into the record, followed by the off-market real estate listing that falsely presented Caleb as the sole decision-maker and omitted my interest in the property. Finally, she mapped out the illicit cash flow funneling directly from our marital savings into his limited liability company to fund a luxury apartment lease in North Ellery. Caleb gripped the wooden edges of the witness stand. He was sweating profusely, his knuckles turning a bruised shade of white, but he still tried to hold on to his crumbling facade. He stammered frantically to the judge, mumbling desperate excuses about a misunderstanding of corporate assets and aggressive business expansion strategies. That was the exact moment Tessa introduced the sworn, notarized affidavit of Sloan Mercer. The color entirely vanished from Caleb's face as Tessa read the statement out loud to the court. But the final, lethal blow was not written on paper. Tessa requested formal permission to play a single audio file submitted into evidence. The courtroom fell entirely silent as my husband's own voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. We all listened to him casually brag about securing clean weekends by trapping his own child at a boarding school. We listened to him describe his teenage daughter's absence as a convenient, necessary way to keep the house looking pristine for private buyer showings. His entire legal strategy collapsed into dust right there on the witness stand. The judge's expression hardened into a rigid mask of absolute disgust. The revelation hanging in the air was undeniable. The infidelity had never been an emotional accident or a passionate mistake born of loneliness. It was a highly calculated, predatory mechanism designed to apply severe psychological pressure, force me to abandon my home in a fit of rage, seize total control of our marital assets, and completely warp the custody narrative in his favor. Tessa then submitted the official, sealed report from the court-appointed adolescent counselor. Everly's voice, though she was not physically present in the courtroom, rang louder and clearer than anyone else's. The psychological report explicitly stated her firm desire to remain permanently with her mother. She formally requested to continue her education at the local magnet school, completely rejecting the academy. The most damning sentence in the counselor's evaluation stated that the 16-year-old girl explicitly refused to be used as a convenient, disposable tool to accommodate the selfish, destructive schedules of the adults in her life. The final ruling delivered by the judge was a comprehensive, unmitigated slaughter. The gavel pounded against the wood, officially awarding me exclusive permanent residency of our home. I was granted full primary custody of Everly. The court issued a strict, legally binding structured repayment order, forcing Caleb to personally refund every single penny he had stolen from the education trust before paying any of his own business debts. Furthermore, he was hit with severe financial sanctions and a formal judicial referral to the district attorney regarding the blatant digital forgery on the loan documents. The professional and personal fallout was instantaneous and absolute. By the end of the week, the public record of the court proceedings completely shattered Caleb's reputation in the local contracting community. His primary financial investors pulled their funding from his limited liability company immediately. The massive commercial staging project he had banked his entire future upon was abruptly canceled. And Sloan Mercer, realizing the ship was rapidly sinking and Caleb was now a massive, toxic legal liability, cut off all contact. She vanished from his life completely, changing her number and her brokerage firm, leaving him with absolutely nothing. He had turned his wife and his daughter into disposable tools for his ambition, and in the end, he was the only one discarded. Several months passed. The harsh, freezing winter slowly melted into a bright, forgiving spring. Everly blossomed at her new school. She made incredible new friends, joined the local theater production crew, and filled the house with loud music and constant, genuine laughter. The heavy, suffocating scent of anxiety that had once poisoned the hallways completely evaporated. I reclaimed my space, room by room, erasing his shadow from the walls. On a warm Saturday morning, I walked out to the front of the property, wearing old denim jeans and a worn-out cotton shirt. I carried a bucket of industrial concrete filler and a heavy metal trowel. I walked straight to the center of the driveway, right there, in the exact spot where that pearl-white luxury car had arrogantly parked to claim my life. There was a jagged, ugly crack in the pavement. I knelt down on the hard, sun-baked concrete and meticulously filled the fracture, smoothing the thick gray surface until it was perfectly flush and unbreakable. It was a silent, deeply satisfying ritual of taking back my territory. Late that same afternoon, I was standing in the kitchen, pouring a tall glass of iced tea. I looked through the large front window just as an unfamiliar, dark sedan drove down our quiet suburban street. For a brief second, the car slowed down directly in front of my house, the red brake lights flashing against the asphalt. A year ago, a lingering car would have made my heart race. It would have sent a terrible, freezing spike of panic through my chest. But as I stood there, holding my cold glass, I did not flinch. I did not shrink back into the shadows or wonder if a new threat was arriving at my door to take what belonged to me. I simply watched the car idle for a moment before it slowly accelerated and disappeared around the corner, leaving the street peaceful and completely empty once again. I took a long, cool sip of my drink, looking around the bright, quiet kitchen. After everything that had been destroyed and rebuilt, the woman who was once treated as completely invisible was now the absolute, unquestionable master of her domain, and I was the only one left standing in this house. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Please let me know down in the comments where you are tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to Amelia Revenge Stories. Hit the like button and smash that hype button so this video can reach even more people who need to hear it.